Hi everyone, Fiona Littlewood here, Principal Librarian at Inspire. I'm here this afternoon with the online book club to talk about our monthly book club read, which this time is The Beekeeper of Aleppo by Christy Lefteri. It's a book about refugees. Nuri and Arya are crossing Europe to get away from the war in Syria en route to meet up with Nuri's cousin in England. So we've got Michelle, Clare Saribi, who was with us last time, and also Alison, who was with us last time. So can I start with you, Clare Saribi? What did you think to it?
Well, I actually only finished reading the book this morning, and I still feel quite subdued. It's very poignant. It's quite harrowing, and yeah, it's going to take quite a while, I think, to process everything that's happened in the book, because it doesn't always feel like fiction. I think it's very realistic. But saying that, I think it's an excellent book. It's written so well, very well researched and quite poetic as well. So I did read it quite quickly, and you know, it was a nice read. I don't quite really want to say enjoyable.
I know what you mean. It was very moving, wasn't it?
Yeah,
very
moving.
affecting. What about you, Alison? Did you enjoy it?
Yes, enjoy in that sense of being impressed with the work that she put into it, and also even from the ebook version, the care that the publishers had taken with it. It's presented so beautifully, and the physical book looks lovely as well. And it's got me over that objection about reading that sort of class of books that's all called the something of somewhere, and all seem to be harrowing and terrible, and the Librarian of Auschwitz and various things like that, that I've never really fancied reading anything in that genre. So it's sort of focused me on reading it, and I really admire the way that she's included all of that very realistic detail, but still allowing you to enjoy her writing and some of the more beautiful scenes and things. So it doesn't feel unremittingly dark, and I can still feel some sort of sense of hope at the end. So I do admire that greatly in her.
I think I've often found that I do learn quite a bit about history through reading fiction, and I know it's not 100% accurate, but it does seem to give you a very vivid picture of what it's actually like. What did you think, Michelle?
Yeah, it does really bring it home, the experience of refugees. I know the author Christy, she worked, didn't she, with refugees, and I think that really comes across. But yeah, I completely agree with Alison that it's really admirable that you are still left with a lot of hope. It is quite harrowing, but it's very accessible. I mean, I read slowly, but it only took me a couple of days to read this one. And I would say if anybody is wanting to find out more about the experience of refugees, read this book. This story really brings it back. It is harrowing, but it's full of hope. But I think it's also quite important to to read about it.
You got anything to add to that, our other Clare?
No, I think people have said it very well. I think I'm interested in the language she uses, because she does manage to be very lyrical and poetic, I think Claire said, and that's true, but at the same time it's not in a way that's dense or tricky or trying to trip you up. It really is leading you through the story, and and it's a really interesting juxtaposition where there are these moments of looking at a scene, or when you're always looking at his wife and seeing beauty. It's always within a scene of decay or destruction behind it, but she manages to move between those two things, I think very skillfully.
There was one thing that I didn't notice myself. I listened to it with someone else, and about halfway through it was pointed out to me that within each chapter, when she moved from one part of the story to the next, she used the last word of one part to begin the next section of the story. So for people who haven't read it, it moves backwards and forwards, but through three basic time periods. There's the past, which was beautiful, and they kept the bees and they lived a lovely life in Aleppo. There was the journey, And then the third part was when they actually arrived in England and their experiences there. If we look at the characters of Nuri and Afra, one thing that really interested me was how they changed over the course of the story. Does anyone want to say a bit more about that?
Can I talk about that a bit?
Yeah.
Because I think they are the central couple, and we begin with Nuri looking at his wife and saying, I think he says, I'm scared of her eyes. And then we discover her eyes don't work properly. So that's quite an intriguing concept already. I mean, he's scared of what her eyes have seen and of the fact they may not see again. There are lots of things for him to be scared of, but their central relationship is really important. And so he's caring for her, he's looking after her, he's dressing her even, and all the difficulties that go with that, when they obviously used to be a healthy, loving couple with a child, who I'm sure we'll talk about later as well. And then she seems to be the looked after person. But as the book progresses, despite her not being able to see, she sees other things. I mean, it's the classic thing, isn't it, of the blind visionary. So she doesn't have visions, but she is acute and she's aware and she understands what's going on. And actually her physical state in some ways is mirrored by her husband's mental state, which as we progress through the book clearly becomes something that's as much a disability to him as her blindness is to her. So I think that that playing with the physical and the mental and emotional trauma that they've both been through and the effects it has on their bodies and their minds is a really interesting thing that happens throughout the book. And we see the support levels and who is the stronger changes with each scene and with each different place that they have to deal with.
I think that's quite true. Nuri seemed to be the one that Afra had to lean on at the beginning, because, as you say, he did everything for her. But it felt that although she was kind of quite weak on the outside, she had this very strong inner core, and that came through towards the end of the book when Nuri was kind of starting to lose it. You know, he was the one who was strong on the outside, but inside he was just finding things even more and more difficult to cope with. What did the rest of you think? How about you, Michelle?
It was really interesting, this idea of her being not able to see, and he was doing a lot for her. But as it goes through the book, that kind of takes you on a journey, and it does become very clear that he is not seeing a lot of things. He's not seeing his wife, whereas she is seeing what is happening to him. But they see they've almost got opposite experiences, but they are experiencing it together, and that does come together quite well at the end, I think.
Yeah. What about the other characters? I mean, they were the two main ones, but there were quite a lot of other peripheral but fairly important characters. Are there any that you particularly liked or maybe disliked? Claire?
I think we've got to mention Mustafa.
Mm-hmm.
I found him really quite a compelling character. I think he leapt off the page. I think he was quite charismatic. And, you know, the book is narrated from Nuri's perspective. And so I suppose a lot of that is how Nuri perceives Mustafa, and all the way through the book he's a beacon of light for him. So, you know, I don't know if that's necessarily a true representation of Mustafa's character. We only meet him at the very, very end. But I found him a really compelling character.
I love the way they wrote to each other.
Yes, yeah, we hear through the emails, and the bond is and the affection and the sort of shared experience. They've had different journeys, but a lot of common ground as well. So I think that's quite a useful way that the author shares Nuri's story as well.
Did you want to add something, Michelle?
Sorry, just about Mustafa. Yeah, definitely very compelling, and he just seems to hold a lot of influence over Nuri. I think it almost symbolises Nuri's hope you know, when he thinks about Mustafa, he has to think about this man that's had such an influence on his life, and that he will get back to him. And he does seem to symbolise hope, I think, a lot in it.
Yeah, definitely.
I think that's why towards the end, when they get to England, he can't take that actual step of getting in touch with Mustafa, because if he contacts him, that's the end of the period of hoping, and it starts to become a different sort of period. And I don't think he can face the fear of that being taken away from him. And listening to interviews with the author, the Mustafa character is based on a real person that she's interviewed and met, who did keep bees in Aleppo, and does now lives in Huddersfield, or near Huddersfield.
I think I was listening to the local news one day, and a beekeeper from Syria ended up being featured, and I thought, well, I wonder if that is the actual man, but it may be the person that she based this book on. Possibly.
Probably many of them.
Yeah. Well, she said that she visited him and spoke to him, and some of his mannerisms and the way in his letters he always writes, "My dearest Nuri." That was sort of how he used to speak when she met him, apparently. So that's all very interesting. So it's sort of knowing that now makes you more confident that the things that she's describing and the situations that people are in, you know, the truth of those, you know, I feel a lot more confident in believing that she has actually spoken to people who've had these experiences.
Yeah, I felt particularly sorry for Angelique. She seemed quite strong when they met up with her in, where was it? Pediontuarius, the park in Athens, which sounded like the most dreadful hellhole imaginable. And of course, she was left behind, and she'd had a very difficult story, which we only really found out about the bones of it. But I just wondered what happened to people like her, you know, that were left there, and how long she would stay there, whether she would ever get out. I don't know whether anyone has any views on Nadim, who was kind of morally quite difficult to... I think what I'm trying to say is that in difficult circumstances, people don't necessarily always make the best decisions. And there were things that Nuri did, for example, what happened in the park with Nadim, and also what happened later in the story, which I don't want to give any spoilers away, but something else happened later in the story where Nuri didn't act. And it's like, should he have done something, should he not? People make different decisions when they're under extreme stress. And I just wondered about think about Nadim in that context, because what he did was really appalling. But people do extreme things to survive, don't they? I don't know whether any of you have got any feelings about that. The moral ambiguity, I think that's what the phrase I'm looking for.
I think that it's, with Nadim, I think it was very important to include him in the book. And I think that is the reality of what it is like for refugees, and particularly for children and women. And we know that so many unaccompanied minors go missing and they're coming from trauma, and then they experience more trauma. And, you know, I think it's just, without commenting on what Nadim did, I think it's just, it would have been wrong not to have included a character like him.
Yeah, I think you're quite right.
I found that very hard to read, but I completely agree with Claire. It's important to include what actually happens, and the lost children. I mean, that really broke my heart thinking about that, and realizing that, you know, mothers and fathers will not know what happened and the things those children went through. And then I think it's very hard to then judge Nuri's actions. I don't think we can. I think there was a question in the back of the book about, do you think Nuri's actions were right or wrong? I think it is completely impossible to answer that, because you just cannot imagine being in that situation. It is so far from our experience.
I think also the point at which he behaves extremely out of character, it's all focused on his feeling of wanting to protect, and particularly protect the children and young people he sees. And so much of the book is, as Michelle says, about those, and Claire mentioned earlier, those very, very vulnerable refugees and those unaccompanied minors. And so his rage and his anger are directed towards somebody who's making things even worse for those children and creating this terrible, threatening, destructive atmosphere around them. And so I think we certainly we wouldn't judge him. We wouldn't say, that he did a bad thing in a very simple way. We can look at it ethically, but what we must remember is that the thing that led him to that not only was all his own trauma and distress, but also the fact that he'd been looking out for various children and young people and realizing that they were being threatened. And I think that's why that was the point at which he behaved in a way that was out of character.
And also at that point, just to add, that he's thinking about Muhammad.
Another very interesting character.
He's gone missing, and what has happened to Muhammad. And at this time, we're also, we're hearing this story through Nuri's words, and we're also fearing the worst. And yes, I think that gives you a perspective on the way he behaves.
It's all directed by the fact that he hasn't even accepted the trauma that Nuri hasn't accepted the trauma that he has gone through. He hasn't accepted that has happened, so he hasn't dealt with it. So it's bound to burst out of him at some other point, his anger and grief that he hasn't actually even acknowledged that he has at this stage.
On the subject of refugees, do you think that novels such as this give people a different picture? Because I know we see a lot of it on the news, and certainly over recent years, and it is affecting. But I think when it happens to a mass of people, it's like back to the novel being a good way to get things over. Do you think it made you more understanding of the plight of refugees?
Oh, most definitely. Most definitely. I think it's the fact of telling that, and because she does it so well, the storytelling of those individual characters, it just brings to life that story, where a news item that's going on in the background while you're doing other things can't. With a novel, you are straight there. The storytelling and the characterization is good. You can feel what they're feeling. It's about. It was very interesting actually. At the weekend, the reading group the reading agency published a survey that said, and that was done to reading groups, and most people in a reading group found that the books they read helped them understand different perspectives and cultures. And I think that's so true. There's nothing like somebody's story.
Yeah, it really brings home that people have a past, and the past seemed like such a wonderful life. I mean, Syria and Aleppo must have been the most wonderful places before they were bombed, and they've also got a future. And I think when we see these things on the news, it's more we're looking at the present and what's happening right now, but it's hard to imagine these people's pasts and futures, which I think this novel does.
I think it's interesting that Lefteri doesn't really make it a political book. You'd find out a lot about the individual experiences of refugees, and she's done loads of research about the particular route they took, going to Istanbul and then to the Greek islands and then to Athens and onwards. But she doesn't talk a lot about the conflict or who's doing what to whom. So we see soldiers and men with guns doing terrible things in the villages. There's only one mention, I think, of Assad, the president, where she talks about the things that will remain unmarked, including Assad's blue eyes, I think is the phrase she uses. And obviously that's in Nuri's mouth. But there's no kind of setup about who the sides are, what the conflict's about, who's doing what to whom. And I think that's must be a very conscious decision to not get bogged down in the facts of the conflict externally, globally, but to say this is what any conflict caused by anyone in any circumstances would feel like to a family who've got this lovely life, which is suddenly then absolutely destroyed. So it's, you wouldn't read this to find out about the politics of the conflict. Which would be a very, very big book indeed if there were to be one. But it just it zooms in. So you've got the general atmosphere, but then it really zooms in on the human experience. And that is why I think readers are reacting to it so positively.
I think to follow from your point, Claire, I think it was writing the book was a cathartic experience for Christy. And I've heard mentioned that since childhood, she's used writing as a way to process and deal with emotions. And after working as a volunteer in Greece with the refugees, that's when she started to write, because she was just so traumatized by her experience and not knowing what had happened to the people who she'd worked with, not knowing to this day what's happened to them. And this was really something she was compelled to do. And the story sort of unfolded itself from the people that she'd met, really.
Yeah. What I found was that so many of the characters, no matter, we've spoken about Nadim, but so many of the other characters, no matter how difficult their lives were, they seemed kind and they seemed to want to help. And one that particularly struck me was the Moroccan man who never had a name. And he always seemed to be there for Nuri, you know, when he was really on the edge, he'd always be there. I'll make you a cup of tea, you know, someone to chat to. And Angeliki as well, she was kind, and she was kind to Afra. And a lot of the characters were, weren't they?
I think that was interesting, particularly when you think about how she uses the bees in the story, because there was one quote, I can't remember who says it, where they were saying that bees aren't like humans, they work together for each other's good. And it's one of the characters saying this, but actually I think you've hit it on the head there. Actually, people on that journey, they do get to see so much help and kindness, as well as all the trials that they go through. And I think that kind of it does really work with setting this backstory of the bees and the worker bees.
And what about the bee in the bed and breakfast, the little damaged bee that Nuri looked after? I don't know whether I'm right, but I sort of took that as a metaphor for the refugees, and in particular Nuri. He was this damaged character, which other people were having to kind of hold him up and put him in a little world where he could survive. I don't know what anyone else made of that.
It's quite interesting as well, going back to your character of the Moroccan man, that it was him who recognised that how important the bee was to Nuri, and went out and spent what money he had on plants to make the little garden. And it really, you know, evoked a lot of painful memories for Nuri. And initially, you know, he didn't appear grateful, but it was because I think he was so transported back to a previous time. So perhaps again, that's that shared experience and that understanding, even though they'd made different journeys for different reasons, that they'd, you know, got that empathy.
Has anyone got any final thoughts?
I think for me, the theme that I've been thinking about in the book is on different ways of seeing and different perspectives. And, you know, we see the book through Nuri's eyes, how his view on things change, obviously, with Afra and her limited sight, which she starts to regain. And perhaps through reading this book, how we view the world and view other people.
Yeah, that's good.
I think that also that, sorry, I was going to, the fact that Claire's touched on the fact that we're looking at it through Nuri's eyes, but we could look at it from Afra's point of view. We could look at it from, I mean, actually nearly everybody, even the Afghan man, the Afghan woman he mentions, the Moroccan man, these people who would just appear, all the characters that come through, you could imagine, and she is leading you to imagine, that each of them has a story that's just as complex and compelling and tragic and so on. And I think that's a strength of the book, because sometimes with a book which has got very strong central characters and a very strong central theme about these people, then the other characters can become sort of sidelined, or they can simply become useful sidekicks for a bit of the show. You know what I mean? And can be just sketched. But even though she hasn't said a lot about the characters, the things she does say just lightly touch on the fact that they too have got a completely different story, and all those people who ended up coming to that B&B, we would have been able to follow any one of them on a similar story. So I think there's that universality about it, which is appealing, and which is a real strength of the book.
I think that's why it will stay in the mind afterwards and affect people's thinking afterwards, because it is encouraging you to see people as individuals and to listen to their stories and not just see them as a mass of people that are all the same, and that we can project negative thoughts onto that mass of people, because we're learning that that's not how it is at all.
So did you all read it, or did you listen to it?
I read ebook.
I read ebook.
I listened to the audio book. So I really like the voice of the narrator and the character he brought to it, and the pronunciation of the words. And
I listened to it too, and I thought the narrator was great. And in fact, towards the end of the book, it almost sounded like he could hardly stop himself from crying. Did you hear that? It was almost, there was a catch in his voice, and it's just very emotional. I don't usually listen to stories. I normally read, but I am glad I listened to that one. So if there's anyone out there that would like to make a few comments about the Beekeeper of Aleppo, I think we're all giving it definitely 10 out of 10 here. We'd love to hear your opinions. So we look forward to you joining us again next month for our next Inspire Online Book Club read.